Go Acadiana with Ken Romero and John Sutherland. And joining us in the studio is Warren Caudle, who's graciously come in this afternoon to talk to us about the Crimea, the Ukraine, and what the heck is going on, right?
Right.
All right. So should we be worried about what's going on? Because today they signed the paperwork doing the annexation.
Say, should we be worried? I think that the more appropriately we say we should be celebrating what's going on. Is that if you look at what the United States has said they've always stood for, and that is that people should have the right to make their own decisions through democratic elections to decide their basic future. If you go back to after World War II, when the world was completely divided between the mean Soviet Union and the good United States of America, they said the real difference was that the Soviet Union basically went into these countries by force and with militaries and made people submit to their way of life and to their forms of government and all. But we were the good people. We would go in and we would help them build roads and bridges and teach them how to farm and build hospitals and schools and all of that. And we made friends by being nice. And then when the Soviet Union, even before the Soviet Union dissolved, we sort of changed some roles in there somewhere. And we went into Vietnam ostensibly was to make sure that they would be free and open elections so that the entire country of Vietnam would decide in a vote on how they wanted to go. And we said we would go by that vote.
Okay.
The problem was that we sent 500,000 military people at one time. We sent 2.9 million over the course, I think it was 13 years or something.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem was there never was a vote held to decide that until after we left in 1975. 58,000 Americans died, untold number of Vietnamese died, and it was all supposedly because we wanted to make sure that they would have the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
Then, fast forward a few years, we went into Gulf War.
Middle Eastern country.
The
right?
Gulf War. What was the name of the place we went in to throw Saddam Hussein out of?
Iraq?
No, the little country.
Kuwait?
Yes.
Kuwait. We went into Kuwait to throw Saddam Hussein out of there because he had invaded the country. So we ran them out of there. Then we decided later on that we needed to go in there and remove him. And why do we need to remove him? Because 99% of the people voted, and they all voted for him, but it wasn't a good election. But we were going to go and make sure they had open, free, and fair elections. And if you remember, our president, George W. Bush, said, that's our mission, to remove Saddam Hussein and to let the people vote and decide what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so we go over there, and they had their elections. Remember that? And everybody had the little purple finger that they dipped in the ink to show that they had voted, so they couldn't vote twice like we do here in Louisiana in some places. So they had the election. The problem was the people we backed didn't win. So we stayed. We had 135,000 American troops there.
Those are vote counters.
I guess, or, to see that the elections were held openly and fairly. But our side didn't win. So we stayed, and we stayed. And then we go into Afghanistan for different reasons. I think we went into Afghanistan for good reasons, and that was to take down the Taliban. But then we also said we were going to leave as soon as they had free and open elections. And they had the free and open elections, and somehow or another things got a little bit corrupted, and we were, spending lots of money and lots of time and lots of effort over there, and we were supporting a lot of different people, including some of the backers of the Taliban, and we still haven't left. So that brings me to the Ukraine and Crimea. Crimean Peninsula has been fought over for centuries by the Ottomans, by the Romans, the Ottomans, the Turks, the British, the Germans, Russians, you name it. I've been there twice, been 3 times to that area, the Russian side in Crimea. You go to Crimea, those people will tell you straight up, I'm Russian. All the signs are in Russian. The language is Russian. Those people identify themselves as Russian. They're one of the biggest things in World War II is they held off a German invasion. They were under siege for just a few days short of a year. And that was with the Crimean people and the Russian army. And that you can contrast that to the fact that all of France fell in less than a month. And these people, they're fiercely supportive of who they are and what they are.
Mm-hmm.
The Soviet Union had bases there. Well, Russia had bases there going back before Catherine the Great. And in fact, I was in a shipyard that she built during her tenure in 1780 something.
You were there in 1781?
No, a little bit later.
I was just
like
wondering.
1999. But in that shipyard, there was the Soviet, now the Russian nuclear navy worked out of there. So you got an untold number of nuclear warhead-tipped missiles. You got nuclear bombs. We have international forces there to kind of like make sure. The big deal was when the Soviet Union fell apart, is we didn't want those weapons winding up in somebody else's hands, like revolutionary Ukrainians or Russians or whatever. And so the Russians says, well, we need to go in and kind of protect our bases and protect our ethnic people or whatever. But the one thing about it, they said, well, let the people vote. Now, that's a novel idea. The people can vote on who they want to side with. In Ukraine, there's been this really a big division among the eastern part, which was Crimea and then on up. They were all pretty much loyal to Russia, more so than the Ukraine. And the western part of Ukraine was more or less loyal to the western nations,
European nations,
and mainland Europe. They wanted to become part of NATO. They wanted to become part of the EU. But the Russian segments kind of always outvoted them, or as they said, they stole the elections. They poisoned one of the presidential candidates a few years ago. And so my point is that if these people vote on the Russian areas of Ukraine to join Russia, that leaves the balance of Ukraine to join the European Union and will be a lot more friendly to the United States than they are now. So I don't know why we're not celebrating.
It's another big question. John, you had any questions about what Warren was talking about?
No, let me go back. One of the things we often look at is these places where the U.S. has had this policy called democratization, as if we're going to go and expand democracy in other areas. But the dilemma is the second these places get democracy, what they really want is any foreign presence, the U.S. included, out of their country so they can manage their own affairs. And it sort of begs the question, if we're committed to the concept, the principles of democracy, then why don't we support nations in sort of realizing what they want to do, their own sort of, national, growth and development towards what they want?
Absolutely.
And what's really strange, we've talked about this during the past week, and I can't remember the name of the book, but Tom Clancy wrote a book 3 or 4 years ago, and lo and behold, it could have played itself out this past week with the woman resigning from the news agency in Russia, the attractive person that the prime minister or the premier goes out to give all his news leaks to. The exact same scenario. The troops move in, they have an election. It was just, when I heard the news stories, I was flabbergasted. I said, did Clancy write this? It was really strange. So where do we go from here, John?
One of the things that I've said about this situation is when it became clear, let me back up. It's clear to me and to most people who look at it, the United States hasn't had meaningful foreign policy in any kind of strategic way since really the collapse of the Soviet Union. We have been in a reactionary posture for over 20 years now. And this is Democrats and Republicans at fault here. You can't point to it and say, oh, these guys are the, it's both parties, because historically at the water's edge, partisan politics was supposed to stop, and then you have American foreign policy. That's the way it worked for most of our country, and during the highlight of most of our solid foreign policy gains, that's what you see. Here, on the other hand, we extend our partisan bickering abroad. So what we have now is a Democrat president opposed by Republicans for doing pretty much what anybody would have done in his spot. What I've said about this is this, and I've lectured on this a couple of times now with my classes. Knowing full well that Russia was going to take Crimea in the first place, why not operate from the position of accepting that and using it as a bargaining chip to smooth the way for Ukraine to join the European Union in the first place?
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree. But, if you go back what you just got through saying about the collapse of the Soviet Union, if you go back there to that point, I think the whole thing got muddled and got off on the wrong foot. Once the Soviet Union dissolved or collapsed or imploded, whatever you want to call it, the U.S. sort of took the idea that we had conquered you.
Right.
And we went in there and with these big, powerful American corporations kind of leading the way and all this, that, and other, and we were going to go in there. And you know, and it's a two-edged sword, is that the people in the former Soviet Union and Ukraine too, the ones who really got involved in business were the people who were involved in the decision-making process with the KGB and the government, and the only way they knew how to conduct business stuff was with a gun and with threats, and you wind up dead if you don't agree with me. And a lot of these American companies went over and found out that they didn't exactly teach that at the Harvard Business School.
Right, right.
And you know, but now some of them stayed, but there were some of them went in there and they really took advantage of a bad situation. And they went in and had some contracts that were so ungodly, unbalanced.
Right.
You know, that you'll get your money, start drawing your royalties when all of our costs are recovered and blah blah blah. And they were in there, you know, putting people up in $1,000 a night hotel rooms and flying people on the Concorde back then or whatever.
Sure.
You know? And then at the end of it, we're never going to get caught up. It was kind of like the old movie Forrest Gump, when the guy that wrote the thing was supposed to get this big royalty, and it was the biggest money-grossing movie in history.
Right.
And then it came down to write him his check, and they said, well, that movie didn't make money.
Right.
That's right. That's right.
And,
Well, and look at the leadership that Russia had post-Soviet Union. I mean, we're talking about one not real bright, not real aggressive, and a drunk Boris Yeltsin. That's the most flattering view of him.
That's right.
That's actually the most flattering view.
And that is pretty much the view I think that most of the people in Russia had of him.
Sure.
And he was willing basically to sell Russia's birthright to get any kind of money, because he was in an absolute panic of how are we going to pay for these things.
Right.
I can remember being in Warsaw not long after the collapse, and literally if you wanted to buy any kind of artifact, any kind of religious icon, they had literally, you know, just raided the churches throughout Russia, and they were selling everything they could. And I went to this, I never forget, this old soccer stadium outside of Warsaw, and they were selling religious icons, Soviet-era weapons, and if you wanted to, as many statues of Uncle Joe Stalin that you could put on the back of a truck.
Sure,
you
sure.
could do it all. And what they did is, you know, the reaction to Yeltsin is why Putin makes more sense when you look at it from the Russian, you know, mentality, needing that authoritarian control. They're not a people that are prone to democracy in the first place.
Right.
The concepts of individual liberty and individual freedom, that's really a Western invention right there. And the Russian people, you know, Churchill had a great phrase about them, that what they are, they look European, but they have an Asian soul.
Mm.
And it's a great characterization.
Let me ask both of you what you think about this. I don't know if you've seen the report, but in 1961, a KGB agent defected, and at that time, he told the CIA and the American government, don't fall for it. Soviet Union's never going to collapse. They're going to fake you out, and they're going to come back and take over. And nobody listened to him then, and I don't think anybody's paying attention now. But when, you know, the wall came down, everybody was celebrating, I thought to myself, never trust these guys. Reagan was right, you know, trust but verify. I'm like, don't trust them and still verify.
Well, you know, and I remember when the wall fell and there were people saying, you know, the same thing. Oh, don't you believe it? And blah, blah, blah. Look, the Soviet Union disintegrated. It absolutely evaporated. There is no Soviet Union. Now, that may gel somewhat again. I mean, you still got this. That's kind of like saying that the Confederate States of America never went away.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're still there. They still got that government. Don't you think they don't? And blah, 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 you know. Well, we know better. And that, you know, I think when it really dawned on me, I was in a meeting one time in Moscow, and we were going to get a visa to go into Ukraine, to go to the Crimea. And we were in this little meeting, and this guy was sitting there, and he said, oh, everybody got to have their passport. I said, okay. And so I said, he said, look here. And he pulled his out, and he said, my country don't even exist anymore. He said, I'm from Ukraine, you know, originally. He said, but look here, it's a Soviet Union passport. He said, the whole country don't even exist anymore. And he pitched it to the girl, and you know, and that was a cold, sobering fact, that, you know, that country absolutely did not exist anymore. And that I don't buy that argument, is that, you know, they faked us out. That's what this one friend of mine, who was an old John Bircher and a New World Order conspiracist and all that stuff, said one time, that 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 David Rockefeller was going to take over the entire world and blah blah blah. I said, now, how do you account for that? When he took over Chase Manhattan Bank, it was the largest bank in the world, and when he retired, it was like, I think, number 15 or something. Oh, don't you dare think that. They do that to fake you out. And I'm like, well, I give up.
Well, no, I mean, when you put those conspiracies really to the test, to a test, they don't really pan out. The fact is this: there was a massive purging after the Soviet Union collapsed of some of those apparatchiks that had literally existed for decades. And now, 20 years on, there's a whole group of them, younger people who have sort of cut their teeth with this new authoritarian, much more of a right-wing government than people think of. It is sort of crony capitalism at its finest, where you see the government and corporate being very hard to distinguish between the two. I mean, very, very difficult. One of my favorites, I had a buddy of mine that I did consulting with in London for years, and during the first early years of the collapse of the Soviet Union, was negotiating a contract with a group of people outside of Moscow. And never forget this, he says everything seemed to be going fine, and during the course of the negotiations, they said, let's go outside for a little bit. And literally they tied him to another guy that he had been negotiating with, gave them each a pistol, and told them, finish the negotiations. And I asked him, I said, what did you do? He said, I raised up right away and shot at the other guy. Well, both pistols were blank. They wanted to test the loyalty of them, each of them. Like you said, the Wharton School, Harvard, no, you don't learn that there.
No.
You don't learn that one there.
The Don Corleone School.
It's a very different game. And this thing about, the old Soviet Union, one of the things about it, Russia wants to be taken seriously. It wants to be consulted in world affairs. It's a great power, and it needs to be consulted. And every time we ignore them or push them or bully them, particularly in their own neck of the woods, all it does is reinforce the xenophobia that's hardwired within Russia towards Western people and Western governments anyway.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And that Pat Buchanan, who I don't read a lot, but I've read a couple of his books. He had a good article the other day, and he was talking about that the Soviet Union birth rate right now is 2/3 the level it needs to be to sustain its population, and that by the year 2050, which is 35 years from now, something, is that they will have already by then lost another third of their population. They've already lost about 25% of it, and I think they're down now to something like 120 something million people.
Yep.
We're at 300 and something. And they're a nation that's dissolving, and that they do have nuclear weapons. They do have nuclear weapons, but we want to get all up in the air. There was somebody talking about the other day about sending in the Sixth Fleet to the Black Sea and flying the B-52s over there and the B-1 bombers and say, okay, Putin, now it's your turn. You answer that. Look, I will say this, that one of the things the two things I think that totally brought down the Soviet Union, one was satellite television, because all at once those people got to see what actually was going on in the rest of the world, and that they'd been lied to so much. Secondly was the Gulf War, is that Saddam Hussein had the fourth largest army in the world. They had the best weaponry that the Soviet Union had, and we wiped it out in 48 hours or something like that. And I think that really and truly that they said, it's a hopeless case. Mm-hmm. And that, take the nuclear weapons out, they don't stand a chance.
Right.
At least that's what I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And wrapping things up, where should we go from here? Either one of you or both of you.
Well, what I would say is this. One, we need to sort of step back from this brinksmanship diplomacy that every time there's a crisis. Remember, it was just a few months ago that we absolutely had to go into Syria. I mean, absolutely commit. Right. We must go into Syria. And looking at it now, aren't we real glad we didn't do that? I mean, one thing the U.S. has to realize, it is the proverbial 800-pound gorilla in the room, and every time something moves, it has the ability to completely upset that balance of power wherever it goes, and it makes it very difficult for a nation to recover from it. We, as a predecessor to going into Iraq, if you remember, we invaded Panama as really a litmus test to see what the world would do in response to that. The world didn't do anything from it, and do you realize Panama has still not fully recovered? And we didn't even occupy Panama.
Right.
We went in there, got Noriega, put him in a jail in Miami. Panama is still recovering from it. We need to think of ourselves, Joseph Nye talks about the difference between soft power and hard power. We need to use a lot more soft power, powers of persuasion, because when you get to the point of having to persuade people at the end of a barrel of a gun, you really have lost the argument.
Sure.
I agree, and that all of these things, the first thing it seems like that our foreign policy people want to do is to draw that line between the good and the bad. And that line gets so skewed, and we find ourselves on both sides of that line so many different times, and that I will agree with John that we need to step back, we need to take a deep breath, and we need to use some common sense on all of these things. And just because of the way it looks, the way somebody says it is not necessarily the way it actually is.
That's right.
A couple of closing thoughts. You saw the Facebook thing where it shows Putin and Obama. Putin's playing chess and Obama's playing marbles. And as I sent you the quote, the paraphrase thing about the eunuch in a harem, he knows what they're doing. He's seen it done, but he can't do it himself.
Right.
That's all I'm saying.
That's good.
All I'm saying.
That's good.
Well, Warren, it's been a
Thanks, Warren.
That's what we do. Thanks for being with us today.
Appreciate it.
I enjoyed it.
Warren Caudle, our guest today.